Hi everyone, my name is Essen and you're listening to the Brown History Podcast. In India, Christians account for about 2 to 3% of the population. However, in the state of Kerala, Christians make up a remarkable 18 to 20% of the total population. Within this Christian community, Syrian Christians play a significant role, representing almost half of Kerala's Christian population. Now, although the Syrian Christians of Kerala are a minority, they are also a caste, race, and class privileged minority that have historically benefited from their privileged position within society. And if the Syrian Christians are the dominant community, then there must be a community underneath them or communities underneath them, and they represent the minority within the minority. Our guest today is Sonja Thomas, author of the book Privileged Minorities, and together we discuss the Christians of Kerala, specifically the Syrian Christians, and navigate the intricacies of caste, gender, class, race, religion, and language. I should have said this sooner. If I pronounced anything wrong in this episode or in any other episode or any future episode, I am so sorry. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast and you're enjoying Brown History and you're enjoying everything and you want to help out and you want to support, do consider being a patron. It really helps a lot. You can also check out our shopbrownhistory.com. You can check out our newsletter. There's so much and so many ways to help out. So thank you for listening, and let's get this started. Thanks so much for doing this.
Absolutely.
It was a great book, but I don't think I'm smart enough for it yet because it's very deep and it's very layered. I think before we can start off talking about the complicated themes of the book, maybe for people who don't know about the history of Christianity in the subcontinent in India, we can talk about that and kind of establish the foundation. Because whenever I think of Christianity in developing countries, I always think of colonialism and missionaries that come to the country. But I was very surprised to learn that supposedly there was a community of Christians long before any major European power had arrived. And from my understanding, one of Jesus' apostles traveled all the way to South India and converted a bunch of people into Christianity.
Yes. And I'd like to first say that that's what this community believes, right? So they call themselves the St. Thomas Christians, or in the scholarly literature, they're known as Syrian Christians, because their mass and their practices are in the Syriac language, which is a kind of a language that is very close to the Aramaic language, which is a language that Jesus spoke. And there are many different kind of Christian churches in the Middle East that come from the Syriac tradition. And yes, when I say they believe this, but it's also supported by the Catholic Church, who recognizes that St. Thomas, the apostle of Jesus, came to India and was martyred outside of Chennai. And yes, this is hundreds of years before Christianity is even brought to Europe. But what is clear, why there's kind of any kind of doubt maybe that the St. Thomas Christians came is, one, because European powers don't like to believe that there's any kind of Christianity there before they bring it there, which it would be the Portuguese coming in with the arrival of St. Francis Xavier, right? So that idea that there's one true Christianity. There's a lot going on in Europe around the time that St. Francis Xavier comes, something called Protestantism. So they need to kind of consolidate what Catholicism is, what Christianity is, what true Christianity is. So if you get into the weeds of things, there's a long historical debate about whether the Christians of India, the St. Thomas Christians, are part of what is called a Nestorian heresy, that the Western Christians would say that the Eastern Christians aren't following Christianity very well. So they try and reform them or convert them. And for Catholics, they try and Latinize them, which means that bring them into the Latin fold or the Western fold rather than the Eastern fold. And these Christians resist. For centuries, they resist. So that's one story about these Christians with colonialism. But the other story is that when the colonial missionaries come, they work mostly amongst Dalit Bahujan communities. Or I would say they're successful with Dalit Bahujan communities.
Lower caste.
Yeah, lower caste. They also tried to convert the Syrian Christians. They were just kind of unsuccessful with that. But when they're successful with British missionaries, so that's Protestant missionaries, German missionaries, and Portuguese missionaries, more successful with converting Dalit Bahujan communities, the Syrian Christians or the St. Thomas Christians really do not mix with the converts that come later.
Just to follow up, that's what they believe, that St. Thomas came and converted people. When the Portuguese came to the Indian subcontinent, did they not mention that, hey, there's already a Christian community there in their historical records? They have. We
They
just don't
do.
know. We just don't know if it goes all the way back to St. Thomas.
Yeah, they don't know if it goes, well, the Western world would doubt that it goes back to all the way to St. Thomas. And there's a little bit of discrepancy amongst peoples in India as well, because something like the caste system was not consolidated in the year 52 when St. Thomas supposedly came. And the evidence that St. Thomas, the apostle of Jesus, came is largely with oral history. And,
Right.
The reason for that is because in much of what happened before the Portuguese came with Christianity was destroyed in an inquisition in Goa. So the Portuguese set up shop in Goa, and they have an inquisition there. A lot of things are burned. Books are burned. There are things called palm leaf manuscripts, which people look into. That is still being cataloged and documented. And there is evidence. And then there's other evidences of things like the St. Thomas cross. It's a very particular cross that churches that St. Thomas supposedly founded still have to this day. The use of the Aramaic or Syriac language, which is still very important for the St. Thomas Christians. The importance of St. Thomas as the patron saint. Almost every St. Thomas Christian church will have a picture of St. Thomas. The traditions that tie the St. Thomas Christians to Christianity in the Middle East. Many in the community will point to those. But what is very clear is that by the year 345, so this is still very early in Christian history, a group of Christians come from the Middle East called the Syrian Christians, under the leadership of a man named Thomas Cana, who brings 72 families with him to Kerala. And they kind of strengthen the existing St. Thomas community, the numbers, right? And then it also leads to hundreds of years of kind of ties between the Christians in India and the Christians in the Middle East. And this is well documented, the fact that the arrival of these families. And then by the 9th century, you have in Kerala something called the Syrian Christian copper plates, which local kings hammer out these edicts on these copper plates. They still exist. And this says like a particular Christian family living in this particular area have all of these rights, these kind of, they're gifted different things. And what they're gifted are very much the types of things that dominant caste Hindus have, like the right to carry a particular type of umbrella, the right to use a palanquin, and the right to buy and sell slaves. So you can kind of see that the Syrian Christians at that time, this is by the 9th century, are in existence, and they have these caste privileges.
Okay, so when I read your book, and it's basically a book about caste, isn't it?
It wasn't my intention.
It seems like if you're confused, if you're trying to learn about caste through Hinduism, it can be very blurry, or it would be very hard to see the privilege and the nuances. But if you study caste through Christianity, Syrian Christianity, it's a bit more clear how caste can kind of be prevalent in the community and what are the caste structures. And I mean, this is what I think, but I could correct me if I'm wrong.
I think I have a sentence in the book where I say we could say that caste is more articulated in Christianity. I think we go to Hinduism because we when we're thinking about caste, because it seems to be the source, and we want to go to the earliest text. But if we go to the earliest history of Christianity, we see caste there. And it wasn't my intention to write a book about caste. I actually came at my dissertation research to look at issues of clothing. But it which becomes one chapter of the book. But when I started to look at clothing, caste is there. Right. And then when I started to look at issues of race and Aryan racial superiority of these particular dominant caste Christians, caste is there. When I look at protests, caste is there. And so in the course of writing the book, I started to realize this is a book about caste. Yes.
Right. And I think before we start talking about caste, can we discuss the root of caste in Christianity? And before Kerala became a state, what was the community of Syrian Christians like when it came to caste, privilege, and I guess their clothing too?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'd like to also say that I'm not exactly a historian. I'm somewhere between an
Me neither.
anthropologist and a historian, right? So most of the book is looking at post-colonial India, so after Indian independence. I do talk about the history of Christians and what they look like, because right around the time of independence, you also see this change in clothing practices. And this happens all throughout India, where the sari becomes really the kind of this nationalistic garment,
Right.
and kind of differentiated against, whatever is happening in Pakistan with garmentation. So, and it's tied to issues of cinema, where you see women wearing a particular type of clothing. With the Syrian Christians, they had a particular type of clothing that was very similar to dominant caste Hindus. And the clothing practices of Dalit Bahujan Christians and Hindus was very, very different. In fact, part of the caste activism that happens in the early 20th century in Kerala is tied to clothing, where Dalit Bahujan Christians fought for the right to cover the upper half of their body.
Right.
And the Syrian Christians already had the right, the ability to cover their upper half of their body, because they were considered dominant caste by the early 20th century. That was pretty solidified in society. So that's what I set out to study, actually, is this change in clothing practice, not just this the breastcloth movement in Kerala, but what happens right after the breastcloth movement, which is the Syrian Christians, which fought like dominant caste Hindus to make sure that that Dalit Bahujan women could not cover, suddenly just say, this Christian clothing that we had that allowed us to cover, it's called the chatatuni, we don't need it anymore. We're all going to move to this secular sari. So I look at clothing as kind of evidence of not just what women were doing, but what dominant caste women were doing. And also I tie it to issues of Aryan racial privilege, because quite literally, the cloth that is used by dominant caste peoples in South India at that time in the early 20th century was white and cream and with gold border, right? And this is considered the Kerala sari to this day, usually used around the time of the festival of Onam, which is Kerala's main holiday. And this still is considered traditional Kerala garments. But Dalit Bahujan Christians and Dalit Bahujan Hindus were not allowed to wear that type of clothing. So I tie it into this idea, if Brahmins, this kind of mythical idea that Brahmins migrated from North India to South India and then push Dravidian peoples as racialized differently into the lower rungs of the caste system. So then an Aryan racial privilege is also a caste privilege, and how that is tied to material practices such as dress.
The root of caste in Christianity comes from the fact that the people that were converted first into Christianity were from a upper caste Brahmin category, and then they kind of wanted to keep that privilege spill over into Christianity, and they basically preserved that level of class by making sure their association with the upper Brahmins is still consistent by doing traditions and the way they dress and clothing and labor, avoiding, I guess, labor and keeping fair skin and things like that. And that kind of spills over to generation. And am I oversimplifying it? But is that it?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to talk about how casteism works because it's so imbricated into
it's hard
into the society, right? Class is one part of it, labor is one part of it. So when the Syrian Christians are gifted land, like I discuss this also in the book, they're considered to be purifiers. So that if something is polluted, quote unquote polluted, by a Dalit Bahujan body, then a Syrian Christian can purify it. And so they become this kind of intermediate caste status. They say they were converted Brahmins, but again, Brahmins weren't exactly the caste system in the year 52. But by the 8th century, they're recognized as dominant caste, and they're recognized as having this purifying power, I guess. And so in a lot of cases, people will say that their family history starts with coming to a particular area because a Brahmin priest asked their Syrian Christian family to come there. I would urge us to look at the work of Nitin Donald, who's looked at Syrian Christian family histories. It's a phenomenon that many Syrian Christian, St. Thomas Christian families have huge books written about their family histories. And they often start with, we were gifted land and became landowners because a Brahmin family needed us to purify things in their temple in this particular village. So it's very clearly, this part of this oral narrative of who the community is. But once you have that, once you become landowners, and once you have a system that enslaved Dalit Bahujan bodies, then Syrian Christians as landowners, especially in the early 20th century and into the mid 20th century, are able to capitalize with accrued generational wealth on land ownership, and specifically rubber cultivation, which I use this statistic a lot. India is the 4th largest exporter of natural rubber in the world, and 90% of it comes from Kerala. And the Syrian Christians have a virtual monopoly over this industry. In fact, I was just writing about a particular priest who said, who promised the BJP party, the central government, a minister coming to the BJP party if the BJP could help with the rubber industry, right? That tie that a priest is saying that politically, and how it affects the Syrian Christian community is very, very clear. So I talked a little bit about land, I talked a little bit about class, and then right now I just talked a little bit about politics, about how the Syrian Christians can be this minority Christian community and still support Hindu right politics very clearly. And you see these alliances you also see it in the education industry, you see it in banking, where the Syrian Christians will make ties to the interest that political interests that also would entrench the class and caste status of dominant caste Hindus, almost at the expense of religion, right? You would assume that Christians would work with Christians, so that dominant caste Christians would work with Dalit Bahujan Christians. But we don't see that. Like right now, there's been protesting in the city of Kochi about a shipyard being built, and it's Latin Christians, so Latin Catholics, which are Bahujan and classified as OBC in the state of Kerala, that are doing that protesting. Meanwhile, the dominant caste Christians are, fighting about whether or not a priest should face the congregation or have his back to the congregation. Their concerns are not the concerns of Bahujan Christians.
This concept of minority is kind of complicated because when I think of the concept of minority, I think of a community that's weak or doesn't have a strong voice. But it's the title of your book, actually. So the Syrian Christians are a minority, but they're a dominant minority, and they're a powerful minority. And you talk about how sometimes when there's a cause, the ones who are oppressed within the minority community come and help the majority. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
What you basically say is that it's a minority is also the minority concept, a community that's a minority. When you call them a minority, it covers up the oppression that's within the minority community that happens between 2 or 3 communities, and that's very dangerous. So in this case, the Syrian Christians are Christianity in India overall is a minority, but if we don't get to go deep down into it, And if we did, we would see that there's a Syrian Christian community that's oppressive to the minority, the Latin Christians. And the Latin Christians, there were times in history where the Latin Christians come out and join forces with the Syrian Christians to protest some kind of law. But when it comes the other way around, they don't really help them out, right?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. Like, there's some times
Oof.
where a minority community can be very united, but then when you have such caste that is so imbricated into the social fabric, that affects, things like the jobs that one have or your experience in higher education or school, then you see divisions in that minority group. And we can see this in, caste in Islam, caste in Sikhism, which is, I think, a lot more people are now starting to study, because I argue this in the book, and it's a complicated concept, but bear with me.
No, I'm all
I
ears.
think when we have so many people in academia that are dominant caste and Hindu, when we think of religion, we tend to think that the other of the Hindu religion is going to be Muslims.
Yeah.
And so we talk about religion as if there's no caste. Then we talk about a religious minority as if there's no caste, because we're talking about religion. And when we talk about caste, we tend to talk about caste within Hinduism. So
Right.
we separate, and I argue this in the book a lot, like we separate, let's say, an intercaste marriage from an interreligious marriage. And we assume that an intercaste marriage is only within, like, a Hindu Brahmin marrying a Hindu Dalit. And we assume that an interreligious marriage is a Hindu marrying a Muslim. But you can have a Syrian Christian marrying a Hindu, and that could be within the caste.
Right.
You can have a Syrian Christian marrying a Dalit Christian, and it's within the religion, but it's an intercaste marriage. Right? Like, so it's much more complex than just to understand that the other of Hinduism is Islam, the other of caste, of dominant caste peoples is Dalit, and then just assume Hinduism. We have to, I argue, like, have a more dynamic understanding of how religion actually functions and how caste actually functions. And when we can understand how they're produced through, like, political alliances, for one, or minority rights that then, as you really eloquently kind of summarized,
I tried.
put certain minority rights over the most vulnerable minorities. That's where I think that we can see that kind of dynamic thing that happens with religion and caste at play. And we can see this in the US too. I see discussions of caste amongst dominant caste peoples who say that, okay, we're going to be targeted as a religious minority now. If you mention caste, you're going to target a religious minority, namely Hindus in the US. Or you're going to target a racial minority, because Indian Americans are racial minorities in the US.
So they need to use that minority card.
That's right.
Okay.
So we have to understand that within minority groups, there's both privilege and subordination. And when it comes to caste, we have historically seen amongst the Syrian Christians that they will protect their caste status over having religious, solidarity.
But there's also gender, and it's interesting to see how it's such a dominant religion. But if we look deep down, we also see that there's Christian women who kind of get the short end of the stick at various times. But when it comes to kind of displaying Christianity to outside religions and to the outside community, women are kind of used as a symbol of power, I guess, or as a status, as a force to, like, as a thing. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah.
As a mascot.
Yeah, I think that's right. They're like a vessel of the community, of a community honor, right?
Yeah.
So the whole idea of, let's say, like, this fabricated love jihad rhetoric.
Yes.
The whole idea of this is that really focuses on female sexuality. And because the caste system is descent-based, it matters who your parents are. It's carried on through the generations. That means you need to regulate female sexuality, women need to marry within the community, within the faith, and within the caste. And so to understand the caste system, we must understand gender. We must understand what women gain from the caste system. In this case, Syrian Christian women as being dominant caste gain something by conforming to particular norms and values. And so I talk in the book about like making sure that Syrian Christian women don't leave the house.
Right.
Their chastity needs to be protected at all costs. Conversely, if you look at what happens with Dalit Bahujan women, the idea that, well, Dalit Bahujan women are out in the public sphere. They need to work side by side men all the time. Therefore, they don't have the same kind of sexual purity as dominant caste women, right? So it's not all rosy. If dominant caste women's sexuality is seen in need of protection, and there's a lot of regulations, a lot of assumptions about what dominant caste women do, it doesn't mean that it's a rosy picture for Dalit women, because India is rife with sexual violence and sexual assault against Dalit women, right? So in that system, when we think about gender, a lot of feminists use the word Brahmanical patriarchy, the intersections of casteism and patriarchy. So I always try and like think about in my research back to issues of love jihad, that very idea is not just that women need to marry within the faith and within the caste, but the idea that if a dominant caste Syrian Christian woman marries a Muslim man or a Bahujan or Dalit Hindu man, then she has been stolen. So she has no sexual agency for herself. You know, she can't make those choices. I wrote an article, it hasn't been published yet, but about how Syrian Christian hierarchy, so priests and cardinals and archbishops have used this rhetoric of love jihad. So it's not just the Hindu right that says love jihad. It is the Syrian Christian community that has been pushing this for over a decade. And they often talk about love jihad at the same time as they also say that Syrian Christian women need to have more children. But what they mean by that is more children within the faith and within the caste. So if you see like if you side-by-side comparison, the last one that gained a lot of press coverage was a bishop who said that not only are Muslim peoples doing a love jihad in the state of Kerala and stealing Syrian Christian girls into marriages with Muslim men, they always use girls too, because of course women are infantilized in this rhetoric, but they also said that Muslim men are starting a narcotics jihad. But
Nice.
a week before, I know people went up into craziness, which they should, because it's Islamophobic as much as it's casteist. But a week before he issued that statement, he had also issued a statement saying that if a Syrian Christian woman has 5 or more children, then they'll get a job automatically at a Syrian Christian hospital and get all these benefits. So that idea of reproducing in the faith and in the caste, and then you put it together with this kind of Islamophobic and casteist rhetoric, it means that we need to understand how gender and sexuality are like the fulcrum to understand how these religious divisions and caste atrocities continue to happen.
You said that Christian women can gain something out of the caste system. What is it that they can gain from this?
Well, accrued generational wealth begets all sorts of things.
Oh, okay.
So
money.
Money.
Pass.
You can attend private schools with that. You can have English language education, mobility. I mean, like going to the United States, just for example, Christians are 2% of the population of India. That's like a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
They're 18% of the population of the United States, of Indian Americans in the United States. And Indian Americans are the most wealthiest racial minority in the United States. And of that 18% of Indian Christians, the majority of Indian Christians in the US are dominant caste. And so when anybody in the United States sees an Indian Christian church, non-South Asians might look at that and say that's an ethnic minority church. But it is a dominant caste church. So not only do you have all those privileges, you also get to set the terms of what minority culture looks like, which minorities need to be protected. So there's all sorts of benefits you get from the caste system, cultural, cultural capital, social capital, economic capital, political capital that you can tap into. It doesn't mean that you don't experience the patriarchy, because you still, might be, I think I speak in the book about these different stories of marrying, not being able to leave the house, being said like, if you do, you're not a very good daughter-in-law, or marrying outside the community. Oh, now since you married outside the community, you're no longer welcome in my relative's house anymore. That's like, so you still experience the patriarchy, but you do get benefits from the caste system.
One of the things you question is, how do you define race in South Asia? And it's very different from how you define race in the United States. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because I got a lot of pushback when I started writing about this. When I was just a graduate student, people would tell me, like, there is no race in India. There's only caste, or there's only religion. Maybe you should use the term ethnicity. America has race. We have caste. Just like a lot of pushback. And I started to use the words Aryan and Dravidian, mostly because that's how my research participants were talking about it. When my Malayalam is not the greatest, I am a heritage speaker, which means I had Malayalam in the household, but I had to learn Malayalam for dissertation purposes. So I mess up my Malayalam a lot, and, especially when I was starting to do research. So I had a question that I wrote out in Malayalam, and I would read it and ask people. And the question was, can you talk about who the Syrian Christians are? Are they Brahmin? Are they, that kind of question, like, who are the Syrian Christians was the question. And the answer that I started to get, which really confused me, was a lot of people started saying, like, well, we're Aryan Marana, and, the other Christians are Dravidian. Like, that's an Aryan. Why would anybody use that term? And so then I started to say, like, what do you mean by this? And I knew a little bit about the history of how British peoples who studied the Rig Veda, namely Max Muller, started to theorize that the Aryans were Brahmins and, came from the north and pushed down south and put Dravidians in the lower rungs of the caste system. But embedded in that is that Aryans are more fair-skinned and Dravidians will be dark. So then I started to hear all sorts of stories when I would press people about the Dravidianness. I'm like, what makes somebody that? And like, oh, well, they're darker, they're dusky. They can stand working in the sun, which makes them better suited for that type of work than us. You start to look at things like matrimonials and marrying within the caste, and you see people talking about fair skin. So I started to say in my writing that this is not just about color. This is about marriage, which brings in issues of Brahmanical patriarchy and caste. This is about labor and the idea of which bodies are more suited for what. And this is about, clothing, the idea that we wear white clothing as dominant caste peoples, and Dalit Bahujan peoples are forced to wear dirty clothing. Who washes your clothes? The washer caste is considered a Dalit caste, right? So the polluting of bodies and how that plays into issues of casteism. Even I argue in that chapter between Christians, the idea, like, there's a kind of myth that the Thomas Cana, who came with those 72 families, some of the Syrian Christian, a group of Syrian Christians will say, well, he married a washerwoman who lost her necklace in the stream, and he tied the necklace around her. And so that's why they're darker than us. So, but it's not just color then, right? The idea of St. Thomas Cana marrying a washerwoman is also about caste, and it's also about labor, right? So I know, because I got my PhD in women's studies and read a lot of Black feminist thought, that Black feminist thought teaches us us a lot about issues of intersectionality, that there's many intersections. There's not just Black and gender and
It's
and
connected.
class. It's very much connected, so that the experiences of Black women may mirror the experiences of Black men, and they may mirror the experiences of white women, but they may be unique as well. So we need to understand the intersections, not just look and say, hey, here's a lot of intersections of caste and gender and race, but to understand how racialized discrimination happens at the intersections of caste, color, religion, gender, sexuality.
I did this episode on North India versus South India, and the guest said that South India has evolved so much from back before independence. So Kerala, you mentioned in your book, it's kind of it's a region that's looked at and studied because they went from being not a place you want to live to a place you would like to raise your children. So it's evolved, basically what I'm saying. These issues that we're talking about, caste and colorism and Syrian Christians not wanting to marry outside of the marriage, not wanting their daughters and women marrying outside of the faith and the caste, is that still prevalent today? And is it prevalent outside of India?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I argue in the book that there had been a lot of changes in Kerala since the 19th century into the mid 20th century. You get almost 180-degree change, where Kerala is considered to be one of the most backward states in terms of issues of caste and casteism, to one of the most progressive states. It starts to become the most educated state. It has 98% literate. Most people, go have their babies in a hospital. The infant mortality rate is low. The maternal mortality rate is really low. The fertility rate, which is how many children on average women have, is very low, which is then tied to issues of literacy, because then you think that women are using family planning to get an education. Kerala is one of the most educated states, as I just mentioned, and they have a population ratio where females outnumber males.
So it's doing good. It's doing pretty good.
Yes, and it has been doing good. Those are consistent since Indian independence time. Since 1947, Kerala always ranks very high on these things. So it's a great place, right? Like it's so progressive.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have casteism in a place that's so progressive. And then you see it popping up, right? So the lesson that I say that we have to see is that not just like when I first started researching, I remember being at a conference and somebody told me, if you really want to look at women and what's happening to women in India, you need to go to Bihar. Kerala's great. And I think this is a really weird argument, like to say like, okay, all these development indicators are great, but let's not look at any of the problems of Kerala because it's pretty good. But what about the problems? Right? I just saw a video of dominant caste Christians trying to keep out Dalit peoples from entering into a road. So they literally put up a fence, and there have been, walls, casteist walls in Kerala to separate Dalit peoples from Hindu Nair peoples in the village. I mean, this is like literal segregation going on. And back to the issues of caste and endogamy, or marrying within the caste and within the faith. When that is the prevalent mode, then the divisions are kept, right? And when you have, in the case of the diaspora, your question about like, does this exist in different places? Well, caste carries with the diaspora. And I mentioned that statistic that 18% of Indian Americans are Christian, and the majority of Christians from India in the United States are from dominant caste communities. Then what happens when you live in an area that's saturated with yourself is that you tend not to talk about it because you don't really have to. It's not affecting you.
Right.
So Prema Kurian, who's a sociologist who's written about the Syrian Christians as well, she has this part in her book called Ethnic Church Meets Megachurch, where she talks about most Kerala Christians call themselves Kerala Christians, but they have no understanding of caste, in the United States, because they don't have those conversations, because you don't have to. It's not affecting you.
Right.
And that's one of the ways in which I see the second generation and third generation, these divisions are still there, but often not talked about, maybe not because people want to continue the caste system, but quite literally people don't know. And I'm an educator, so I'm about educating people. And I've had wonderful conversations talking to churches in the United States, talking to young people who are exploring this history for the first time. I thank you for doing an episode on this
Don't
as
worry
well.
about it.
Yeah, because the more people are educated, I do see a willingness within the community to talk about it more frequently. That said, you also have a lot of conservative movements, especially in Kerala right now. There was just a report about Syrian Christians being very almost militant in their defense of the caste system and their support of kind of Islamophobic policies of the Hindu right.
When you released this book, did you get a lot of hate from your community?
Well, that's a good question to ask too. Like, thank you for that one. So I did not grow up in a Syrian Christian community. I grew up in rural Montana. And so I wonder sometimes if it almost helped me I have parents who are very supportive. They actually, I don't think they knew what I was doing at first. I have 5 siblings and they all went into the sciences, and they just hoped I would get a job, I think.
Right.
But they also told me, like, don't lie, like, tell the truth. Oh, this does exist in our community, and if you're researching and telling the truth, that should be told. And they're very Christian and very devout, and they also said, like, it is our duty to care for others. That's what our religion teaches us.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that it would be difficult to do, but when I started doing the research, I think there's a lot of people who are reticent to talk about issues of caste. And I kind of use anthropological methods of, like, thinking about what we call studying up, because you're studying power. So how do you gain access to those spaces? Priests might not want to talk to you. People might not want to talk about their caste privilege. So we can ask about something else. Like I talk about in Catholicism, there are different rites, RITE, of Catholicism. The Latin rite is considered Bahujan. The Syro-Malabar rite is considered dominant caste.
When you say right, what do you mean by right?
So Catholic,
like sect, like dominant,
yes,
like a sect of Christianity, basically.
Yeah, a little bit like a sect of Catholicism.
Okay.
So they're Eastern. You can think of like Russian Orthodox,
right,
those
right.
of traditions.
Egyptian Coptic.
Egyptian Coptics, yes. Okay. So the Syrian Christians are part of that Eastern, because they have that Syriac/Aramaic traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But since they're supposedly Brahmin, right also kind of indicates caste.
Right.
Because the Latin rite is considered Bahujan and brought by the Portuguese.
Right.
Right. So you can talk to people about rites, right? Which is what I try and talk to people. Like, if you say you're Roman Catholic, would you bury your grandparents in a Latin rite cemetery? No. Would you do your catechism in a Latin Catholic church? No. You have to, in the Syrian Christian traditions, you have to have certification of religious education in your church to marry within the church, which means you would have catechism within your own right and not that right.
It's complicated.
It does get complicated.
Yeah.
It does get complicated.
Does the other Catholic rites, when they from the West, when they look at the do they say anything about the caste system, or are they aware of that this is going on, or it's nothing really of their concern?
I don't think they understand it.
Okay.
I'm doing a research project right now about Catholic priests from India in the United States. And I've been trying to talk to people who are gathering data about international priests in the United States on missions to talk about right and caste. Because my ethnographic research has revealed that the vast majority of priests that are coming from Kerala and coming from the dominant caste rites. Here's another factoid. The vast majority of Catholics in India are Dalit Bahujan, but the vast majority of bishops are from dominant caste rights.
Power.
Yeah. So a lot of people, they're just, especially non-South Asians and non-Indian Catholics, are not aware of it. But what I have found are little factoids. Like there was a report released about Asian American Pacific Islander Catholics in the United States, and they found that Indian Latin Catholics chose not to go to Syrian Rite churches. They chose to be religious minorities in white churches. I mean, racial minorities in white churches rather
than... That reveals a lot.
It reveals a lot. It suggests that they might, Latin Catholics, Indian Latin Catholics might not be accepted in a Syrian Rite Catholic church, right? And another factoid that I found, this is again from Prema Kudian's research, she did not find any Latin Catholic or Dalit Christian advocacy group within Indian Christians, but she found that Latin Catholics and Dalit Bahujan Christians join Ambedkarite organizations in the diaspora. Again, very telling, because there are many Syrian Christian groups in the US. So that's,
there's a problem. There's a big problem.
There's a problem.
Yeah.
And to go back to your thing of, do I get kind of pushback from the community? I would say I have a little bit, but knowing what Dalit Bahujan scholars get, I don't get rape or death threats.
All right.
What I do get is people who try and argue with me. And they argue with me by telling me the one anecdote that supposedly refutes everything. Like, I know a Syrian Christian who married a Dalit Christian and they're fine. I'm like, that's true. Or I know Dalit peoples who converted to Syrian Christianity. So that happens. And that is true. There are Dalit peoples who converted to Syrian Christianity. They're not the majority, right, but it is. And there are people who marry across caste lines and face no discrimination. That can be true too. But that doesn't mean that the systemic discrimination or that accrued generational wealth has suddenly gone away by your one case that is against what the majority of cases are.
It's like someone saying, I'm not racist, I have black friends. Like that, kind of like that.
I use that same analogy to explain this. Like, we're so smart as like Indians in the diaspora to understand how silly it would be to say, I'm not racist, I have a black friend, but we don't do the same when it comes to caste. I'm not casteist, I know somebody who's Dalit, or I know somebody who married a Dalit. You know, we do say that with caste. And that's usually the type of pushback that I've got that people try and do some kind of argumentation with me. And I attribute that to the fact that I come from a dominant caste community myself. Right. And I can only imagine that if I was a Dalit Bahujan scholar, that I would not receive that same type of reception.
We were talking about your book, but there was another book that came a long time ago called The God of Small Things. I was too young I read the book when I was really young, but I couldn't finish it because I was just too young to understand what was going on. Now with your book, I can go back and read it. That book talks about intercaste marriage.
Yes.
When that book came out, what was the response to it? It must have been a big deal, and it got a lot of fame. It won awards.
It did. It won the Booker Prize, and is written by Arundhati Roy,
yes.
And who went on to be an activist, right? And Arundhati Roy, in that book, the main character, who's a Dalit Christian, is named Valata, which means white. And she says he's named Valata because he's so black. And the woman, the main character, who's a woman in the book, is a Syrian Christian, and she's described as being brown-skinned. So that, again, these color/religion. Right. And Valata does work on her plantation-owning family's land, right? Like, so a lot of what I'm talking about here with land, color, caste, religion, and sexuality is playing out a lot in this book, I would say, too. She wrote her book before I wrote mine. But her book is a book of fiction, too. Yes, I think it introduced a lot of people to how Kerala works with issues of caste and Christianity. I think it got people a little bit talking. But in the state of Kerala, the Syrian Christians, there were lawsuits against her book saying that it, quote unquote, hurts the religious sentiments of the Syrian Christians. Yeah, and the thing that they located as hurting the religious sentiments is the relationship between the two main characters, a Dalit Christian man and a dominant caste Christian woman. That is the problem. There are many kind of other things that happen in the book that people could object to, like issues of molestation,
Right.
a death. No, they had the issue that they had, the lawsuits that were against this book in the state of Kerala were about the intercaste marriage or intercaste relationship.
My last question, and I think it's a tough one, but what do you think this generation and the people that are listening can do to kind of eradicate this system as best as possible?
Yeah, I think people who have caste privilege need to, at the very least, stop being so fragile and start having conversations in their own community. I see a lot of people just say like, well, we never talked about it in my family. It's not an issue. Yeah, because you have the luxury not to talk about it.
Right.
Is that where we are? People who are academics who have caste privilege, at the very least, you can start teaching Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in issues of caste in your classes, which hasn't also been done enough. I can only imagine being a Dalit Bahujan student and taking a class on South Asia and not learning anything about caste at all. Like the hubris of that is just astounding to me. But just at the very least, stop being so fragile and start trying to learn and have conversations. For Dalit Bahujan peoples in the diaspora, I think that they have and continue to do activism about this. Casteism in Christianity is well known to them. People who don't have caste, who are caste privileged, need to listen to what they're saying and center their voices.
Very cool. Do you want to add anything, or do you want to say something? Do you want to talk about the book? Do you want to sell it?
Yeah, it's with University of Washington Press.
Privileged Minorities by Sonja Thomas.
Sonja Thomas.
Sonja. Oh, so it's pronounced Sonja.
Yeah, interesting story. My parents met in Germany and had a love marriage, even though they were in the same caste and same religion.
That worked out.
He gave me the German spelling of Sonja.
Oh, that's cool.
I think the tagline when my book was first published, I put a tagline in my email that said, "Buy my book, it's awesome." And I just did it for fun, but now I say it all the time. So buy my book, it's awesome.
It is an awesome book.
Thank you.
In Christianity, the caste system, how do you know someone is of a caste? Don't your names change? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like I guess with Hinduism, you have a last name and you can kind of track it down, but with Christianity, you have names like Thomas and Thomas, whatever. So yeah, how does it show, basically?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and just about casteism in general. How do you know someone's caste?
I mean, in the Christian dominion.
Yeah, I always answer like, well, you don't necessarily. Nobody announces their sexuality either, and yet we still have homophobia, right? Like, so with names is one of the markers, but I think another marker is location. And I always say that, in Malayalam, one of the first things that you say to people when you meet somebody who's Malayali is "Naad evidana." It literally means like, where is your home place? Where are you from? In a way, like, where is your family from? Where is your kin and community from?
Mm-hmm.
And they might also ask "Vitul Beranlana," which means what is your house name? So Syrian Christians are named their house name. It's kind of like a clan, I guess. Their father's first name, and then your first name. So I would be TT Sonja.
Okay.
The T is the Thomas is my dad's first name. And that is, you'll see a lot in the diaspora that Syrian Christians will take their father's first name as their surname. So Syrian Christians will often have the last name Philip, Alex, Thomas, Matthew. Reason for that is because in this area of India, there was a lot of, there was what's called matrilineal inheritance, which is descent through the female line. But the Brahmins, the Hindu Brahmins, Nambudiri Brahmins, had descent through the male line. And the Syrian Christians also have descent through the male line. So once you're married in the Syrian Christian faith as a woman, you no longer belong to your family, you belong to your husband's family, and you're known by your father's name, you're known by your husband's name. So it's very common to see Thomas, Alex, Philip as last names of Syrian Christians. But it might be very common to see a Dalit Christian name those names as well, right? So then there's other questions like, where are you from? And if I said Kottayam district, heavy concentration of Syrian Christians, right? Like if Central Kerala. If I said, also my name is Thomas, and then I said my house name is Timulangad, people might know that there's a priest from that particular place that has that name. I think what's a better marker for Christians, if people are trying to figure out what caste you are, is where you did your catechism from. What is your family's church?
Mm-hmm.
If your family's church is the Syrian Christian church, you've already been where was your grandfather buried? Were they buried on the Syrian Christian land or the Dalit Bahujan Christian land? In the cemeteries. Cemeteries are segregated.
Yeah, that is so weird.
But even in death.
Yeah, even in death, that's just weird. Yeah. Just crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was such a pleasure. I loved talking about this. It was very eye-opening. And yeah, and I'll put this out hopefully tomorrow. I'll try my best. But yeah, if anything else you want to add in?
No, thank you for having me. And if you have any other questions or